They were tall, they were stiff, they were worn until they split in two. Cowboy boots were more than just footwear. They were armor, prison, and sometimes punishment. They walked thousands of miles through cactus, snow, rattlesnake nests, and spilled whiskey. And they rarely, if ever, came off. That's where the trouble started. Never taken off. Not really. Cowboys didn't just wear boots, they lived in them, on the trail. There was no time to soak your feet or let them breathe. You saddled, up at dawn, rode hard all day, and fell asleep by the fire with your boots still on. Rain, dust, blistering heat, your feet were trapped in leather coffins. Some men wore their boots for weeks without pulling them off. Why? Because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to put them back on. Boots shrunk when they dried. Feet swelled from riding. You had to grease the inside with bacon fat just to squeeze back in. So cowboys did the unthinkable. They kept them on, day and night, dry or soaked. And what happened to their feet inside? Let's just say, it wasn't pretty. The perfect storm for disaster. Boots were made of thick leather, often unlined, with nails holding the soles together. No arch support, no breathability. Just raw cowhide pressing against skin, hour after hour. Inside those boots, sweat built up, dust settled into nails, cracked skin turned soft, and Palian blisters grew like mushrooms. No. Add heat, add rubbing, add the fact that some socks hadn't been changed in weeks, or didn't exist. The result? Infections, calluses, abscesses, skin peeling in strips. One cowboy wrote that his feet smelled like pickled meat left on a wagon wheel. Another said removing his boots was worse than a gunshot. Blisters, blood, and wrote a single blister on the trail could become a serious problem. Cowboys didn't stop for foot care. They popped it, wrapped it in dirty cloth, and kept going. That meant dirt got in, infection, foul wetpus built up, and the boot kept pushing. Hour after hour, some men came home with blackened toes, or feet that squelched when they walked. There are letters describing socks so stiff with dried blood they had to be cut off with a knife. And worst of all, the smell. Feet soaked in sweat, grease, river water, and horse dung took on a stench that lingered even after the man was gone. One camp cook refused to serve food until the boots were moved outside the tent. Boots that didn't forgive. New boots were even worse, stiff, unbroken. They tore up the skin. Ankles rubbed raw. Heels bled. Toenails split in half. And still, the cowboys wore them. Why? Because soft shoes wouldn't survive the trail. Because boots protected from rattlesnakes. Because image mattered. A cowboy with worn-out boots was just tired. A cowboy with new, shiny boots was ready for a fight. But that meant pain. Blisters inside. Blisters, toes jammed like firewood in a barrel, and no chance to take them off until the next town, if there was one. The smell was legendary. Let's be clear. Cowboy boots didn't just smell bad. They smelled alive. Inside those boots, toenails curled like tree bark, heels cracked, and bled. Sweet fermented socks, if worn, dissolved into the leather. Cowboys joked that their boots had names because they were personalities all their own. One man claimed he could tell which bunk was his just by the smell of the boots hanging from the beam. Another described his as walking mold farms. If the pain and smell weren't bad enough, there was one more reason cowboy boots were a waking nightmare. You never really knew what was waiting inside. The American frontier wasn't just rough. It was alive, and most of it wanted to crawl into the warmest, darkest place it could find. That place? Your boots. The snake that wasn't sleeping. Every cowboy knew the rule. Always shake out your boots before you put them on. Why? Because one day you wouldn't be alone in there. Rattlesnakes were the most infamous guests, especially young ones. Small, quiet, and deadly. They didn't strike right away. They waited, curled at the bottom, hiding in the toe, and when you jammed your foot in, they panicked. Cowboys told stories of men hopping around camp screaming, trying to get their boot off before the second bite came. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. And the worst part, you couldn't always hear them rattle. One man claimed, the snake was as quiet as my own conscience. That's what scared me. Not just snakes, it wasn't just rattlers. The West had no shortage of intruders, scorpions hiding in the heel, ready with the sting. Spiders, big ones that clung to your toes. Beetles, laying eggs in the linen setups, coiled like wire springs in the darkened mice, looking for a warm nest, and leaving behind dropping simagine slipping on your boot, and feeling something wriggle between your toes. By the time you got it off, it was already too late. Even if it didn't bite, the psychological damage stayed. Some men claimed their foot never felt right again. Others simply burned the boots and walked barefoot for a week. When water made it worse, you'd think stepping in water would at least clean the inside of your boots. Wrong. It made everything worse. Boots soaked in rain, river water, or even spilled coffee became swamps. The leather trapped the moisture. Your feet steamed inside. And the next day, mushy socks, slimy soles, and sometimes fungus that bloomed like wildflowers. One cowboy described his boots after a river crossing as hot pudding with toenails. Others said their feet came out wrinkled, white, and soft like bread dough. The perfect place for bacteria to move in. And again, no one took them off, because taking them off meant dealing with the damage, cuts, splinters, and surprise. Metal inside of cowboy boots wasn't built for comfort. If a nail came loose, it stayed loose. If a seam tore open, you stuffed a rag in it. If a stick or thorn pierced through the sole, too bad. Boots weren't soft. They were rough, full of friction, and sometimes dangerously improvised. Cowboys often used rope, tin, or saddle leather to patch them. One unlucky rider stepped on a nail, drove it through his foot, and still wore the boot for 3 days because there was no other option. By the time he took it off, the nail was rusted and fused to the sock. He kept the boot, called it old. Biter. The foot became the boot over time. The line between foot and boot blurred. Blisters turned into calluses. Calluses cracked into wounds. And the leather shaped itself to every flaw in your step. One man said, "My boot knows my pain better than I do." Another swore he could tell the weather based on how tight the boot got. Some cowboys claimed the boot would talk to them, creak, shift, tighten like it had a mind of its own. And maybe it did. After all, anything worn that long, soaked in that much sweat and grit, and shared with so many creatures, wasn't just a boot anymore. It was part of you. There's pain, there's blood. And then there's the quiet horror that starts at your toes, long after the blisters, after the snake bites and scorpion stings. The true danger of cowboy boots revealed itself. It didn't scream. It didn't sting. It crept in, slow, moist, and final. Rot, infection, decay. And by the time you noticed, it was too late. When a boot becomes a tomb, cowboys who didn't remove their boots for days or weeks weren't just enduring bad smell or pinched toes. They were risking something worse: colon necrosis. The pressure of the boot, the constant rubbing, the trapped heat and moisture, all combined to create the perfect storm for tissue death. It started with numbness. Then came black patches. Then came smell. By the time someone said, "What's that on your sock?" the toe underneath had already died. The gangrene trail. Gangrene was one of the most feared words on the trail. It meant the tissue had deep infection was spreading. There were no doctors and no painkillers strong enough to help a cowboy with gangrene. Had 2 options. Pray it stopped on its own. It didn't cut it off ease. That's exactly what it sounds like. Amputation. Trail-style amputations weren't done in hospitals. They were done by fellow Ritter saloon keeper scooks with hunting knives. There are stories of men laying on makeshift tables while their friends heated a branding iron and sawed off a toe, a foot, sometimes more, to stop the spread. Whiskey was the anesthesia. A belt between the teeth was your only comfort, and after that, you put the boot back on, because walking barefoot in the desert wasn't an option. One man kept riding with half a foot, stuffing the boot with horsehair and newspaper. He called it his lucky limp. Infections you couldn't see sometimes. It wasn't dramatic. There was no green flesh, no screaming amputation. Just a slow sickness. The foot hurt, then it ached, then the whole leg burned. A cowboy might think it was a sprain, until the fever came, and the chills, and the vomiting. By then, it was sepsis, blood poisoning, and without help, it was a death sentence. Men died in their sleep on the trail. Their friends found them cold, boots still on, hat pulled low. The boot never came off. Socks as a death sentence. AO might think socks helped. Sometimes they did. But dirty socks Worn too long, could trap infection against the skin. They became sponges for bacteria, especially when wet. One writer wrote, "My socks turned stiff after 3 days. I wore them for 10. Another admitted he never owned socks. Using strips of blanket instead. If your sock rotted, it didn't come off clean. It peeled off with the skin. Some men swore their boots grew something inside. No one wanted to check. The itch you should never scratch. Foot fungus wasn't just common, it was expected. The boots trapped sweat and heat. Fungus thrived. It started as an itch, then a rash, then open sores, but scratching made it worse, so cowboys learned to ignore it or pour whiskey on it and keep going. One old-timer claimed he poured gunpowder and vinegar into his boots to kill whatever was growing. He lost 3 toes, but he kept the boots. Pride versus pain. Despite all this, cowboys refused to give up their boots. They were a mark of identity. Of toughness. Of tradition. Men with amputated toes kept wearing the same size. Men with rotting feet refused. Help. One gambler was buried with both boots on, even though one foot had been missing for years. To remove your boots was to admit defeat. So they stayed on, tight, bloody, alive, in all the wrong ways. By now you might wonder, didn't cowboys try to take care of their boots? They did, in ways that were creative, misguided, desperate. And sometimes flat out insane, because on the frontier, you worked with what you had, and what they had was salt, spit, fire, and folklore. The vinegar cure. Vinegar was the go-to answer for everything. Burning feet, soak them in vinegar. Boots too tight, pour vinegar inside. Fungal rot, rub vinegar on the skin until it stops itching, or until the skin falls off, whichever comes first. Men kept jugs of vinegar in camp, not for salad, but for foot maintenance. Some even heated it with pepper and rubbed it inside the boot to kill whatever's in there. One cowboy claimed vinegar made the leather soft, another swore it burned out the evil. Neither was wrong. The whiskey wash couldn't get vinegar. Use whiskey. Not for drinking, for scrubbing. Cowboys poured it into boots, wiped it over wounds, even used it to soften stiff heels. Problem was, the boots absorbed it like a sponge. Then your feet reeked of sour mash and saddle oil for a week. One gambler said he wore the same boots for years. When he died, the undertaker opened one and passed out. No one ever checked the other. Fire as a foot tool. Some cowboys tried to sanitize their boots with fire. They held them near open flames, hung them over smoking logs. One guy tossed his pair onto hot coals and waited until the lice stopped screaming. It worked, kind of. The boots came out warped, brittle, and burned. The smell? Imagine old bacon, wet leather, and ghost stories. One man claimed his boots were so dry after fire treating, they cracked when he tried to smile. Grease and lard, the cowboy lotion cracking leather. Raw heels, skin peeling off in sheets. Time to reach for animal fat. Bacon grease, bear tallow, even chicken drippings. Cowboys rubbed it into the leather and their feet. Some said it worked. Others said it attracted flies so badly they had to sleep with their boots under their blankets. One saloon girl joked that a man's boots were better fed than he was. Salt in the socks. When blisters turned to rot and rot turned to fever, there was always one last resort: salt, poured into boots, rubbed between toes, sprinkled inside socks. The idea was to dry out the evil. What it did was cause burns, open cracks, and screams no prairie wind could silence. Still, it was common, because it was cheap, because it was something, because, if nothing else, it distracted you from the smell. The myth of the break-in. Every cowboy believed one dangerous myth: boots just need breaking in. No matter how stiff, tight, or painful they were, if you just walked long enough, the boots would soften. They rarely did. Instead, your feet bent, your bones shifted, your toes blackened to fit the boot's idea of how they should be. By the time the boot was finally comfortable, your foot was no longer the same. One rancher joked that he had shoes older than his memories. The boots outlived the man, and in the end, they always did. Boots lasted longer than the cowboys who wore them. They were passed down, stitched, patched, shared. Some men were buried in them. Some boots were nailed above doors for good luck. Others were burned after a fever too dangerous to keep, because boots didn't forget. They remembered every mile, every wound, every mistake. They absorbed it, held it, carried it forward. One old-timer said, "The boot knows what the foot won't say." Final thought: think of cowboy boots today as fashion, polished, stitched, symbols of the West. But back then, they were weapons, they were prisons, they were a gamble every time you put them on. They protected you until they didn't. Because the real horror of cowboy boots wasn't what they walked through, it was what they did to you while you wore them.